In the late afternoon of May 21st, 1940, German soldiers of Erwin Rommel's 7th Panzer Division found themselves in a state of complete panic. British tanks had smashed through their anti-tank screen and were overrunning their positions. German artillery crews abandoned their guns. Infantry scattered in confusion. Shells bounced harmlessly off British armor. Yet among these seemingly unstoppable machines were some of the worst tanks ever fielded by any nation in the Second World War. Slow, cramped, and armed with nothing more than a single machine gun, the Matilda One was obsolete before it even rolled off the production line. This is the story of a tank designed for a war that had already ended, built on a budget that guaranteed failure, and sent into battle against an enemy it had no hope of defeating. In 1934, the British Army was wrestling with a fundamental question about the future of armored warfare. Two schools of thought had emerged. The progressive thinkers, like tank theorist Percy Hobart, believed in fast, mobile armored forces that could strike deep behind enemy lines. The traditionalists, men who had fought in the trenches of the First World War, saw tanks primarily as infantry support weapons, designed to crawl alongside foot soldiers and crush enemy machine gun nests. Lieutenant General Hugh Ellis, the Master General of Ordnance, fell firmly into the traditionalist camp. Ellis had led the tank corps during the First World War and had personally commanded 350 tanks at the Battle of Cambrai in 1917. He knew tanks. Unfortunately, what he knew was 20 years out of date. Ellis and his colleagues envisioned infantry tanks as slow, heavily armored vehicles that would advance at walking pace alongside the infantry. Speed was unnecessary when you were matching the pace of men on foot. What mattered was protection against enemy fire. When Brigadier Percy Hobart, then Inspector of the Royal Tank Corps, proposed specifications for a new infantry tank, he suggested two alternatives. One was a large, well-armed vehicle with a cannon and heavy armor. The other was a small, cheap tank armed only with a machine gun, designed to be built in large numbers to swamp enemy defenses. Given the severe financial constraints of the mid-1930s, Ellis chose the cheaper option. This decision would have catastrophic consequences. The task of designing this new tank fell to Sir John Carden at Vickers Armstrongs Limited. Carden was one of the most talented tank designers Britain had ever produced. Together with his partner Vivian Lloyd, he had created the Carden-Lloyd Tankette, a small tracked vehicle that became the foundation for armored vehicle development in over a dozen countries. He had designed light tanks, artillery tractors, and even the world's first amphibious tank. But Carden was working under impossible constraints. The General Staff specification demanded a tank that could be built cheaply using commercially available components. The vehicle had to be delivered quickly, and costs had to be kept to an absolute minimum. In October 1935, Carden produced his initial sketch for the new tank. It showed a low, small vehicle with a single turret and a single machine gun. The design was given the codename Matilda. The name would later be attributed to the tank's waddling gait, but in truth it was simply a Vickers project designation chosen before the prototype ever moved. Tragically, Carden would never see his creation enter combat. On December 10, 1935, he was killed in an air crash near Tatsfield in Surrey while returning from Belgium on a Sabena airliner. He was 43 years old. Britain had lost one of its most capable tank designers just as war was approaching. The Matilda One that emerged from the Vickers works was a monument to compromise and cost-cutting. The vehicle used a Ford V8 engine producing just 70 horsepower, the same engine found in civilian automobiles. The gearbox came from Fordson tractors. The steering mechanism was borrowed from Vickers light tanks. The suspension was adapted from an artillery tractor. The result was a two-man tank weighing 11 tons. The driver sat in the front of the hull, cramped into a space so tight he could barely move. Above and behind him, the commander occupied a small cast turret fitted with a single Vickers machine gun. In some vehicles, this was the standard .303 caliber weapon. Others received the heavier .50 caliber version. Neither was capable of penetrating enemy armor. The commander's position was equally miserable. He had to operate the machine gun, traverse the turret, use the wireless radio, and direct the driver, all by himself. The turret could not even be rotated forward while the driver's hatch was open. The only apparent virtue of the Matilda One was its armor. With 60 millimeters of protection on the front, sides and rear of the turret and hull, it was proof against the standard German 37 millimeter anti-tank gun. But this protection came at a price. The Matilda One could manage a top speed of just 8 miles per hour on roads. Off-road performance was even worse. The exposed tracks and running gear were vulnerable to damage and prone to clogging with mud. The narrow tracks created high ground pressure, causing the tank to bog down in soft terrain. The British Army had ordered a tank that was too slow to advance, too poorly armed to fight, and too small to be upgraded, and they knew it. Even as the first order of 60 Matilda Ones was placed in April 1937, work had already begun on a successor, the much larger and better armed Matilda II. The Matilda One was designed as a stopgap, a temporary solution until something better could be built. Unfortunately, temporary solutions have a way of becoming permanent problems. When war broke out in September 1939, 140 Matilda Ones had been produced. They equipped the 4th and 7th Battalions of the Royal Tank Regiment, which deployed to France as part of the British Expeditionary Force. For months, the tanks sat idle during the period of inactivity known as the Phony War. Then, on May 10, 1940, Germany launched its invasion of France and the Low Countries. The British armoured force on the continent consisted of 58 Matilda Ones and just 16 of the newer Matilda Twos. This was the only significant British tank force available to face the German blitzkrieg. On May 21, 1940, British forces launched a counterattack south of Arras. The attack force included tanks from the 7th Royal Tank Regiment with 23 Matilda Ones and 16 Matilda Twos, and the 4th Royal Tank Regiment with 35 Matilda Ones. What happened next became one of the most dramatic tank actions of the entire war. The British tanks advanced in 2 columns against Rommel's 7th Panzer Division. The Germans were caught completely off guard. Their standard 37mm anti-tank guns, the weapons they had relied upon throughout the campaign, proved useless against the heavily armoured British tanks. German shells bounced off the Matilda armour. One British tank was hit 14 times without being knocked out. German gun crews were overrun. Infantry panicked and fled. The SS Totenkopf division on the German left flank began to retreat in disorder. Rommel himself arrived at the scene to find his men in chaos. Artillery crews were abandoning their guns. Vehicles were jammed together on roads and in village squares. British tanks were advancing through the confusion, machine gunning everything in their path. Standing beside his guns, Rommel personally directed fire against the British armour. His aide, Lieutenant Most, was mortally wounded at his side. The situation was, in Rommel's own words, an extremely tight spot. But the Matilda Ones had a fatal flaw. Their machine guns could suppress infantry and destroy soft-skinned vehicles, but they could not knock out German tanks or dislodge dug-in anti-tank guns. They could advance, but they could not destroy the enemy. What finally stopped the British attack was not anti-tank guns, but heavier weapons pressed into service against armour. German 105mm howitzers and 88mm anti-aircraft guns were brought up and formed into a gun line. These weapons could penetrate the thick Matilda armour at long range. The British tanks, unable to silence these guns with their machine gun armament, were picked off one by one. The attack ground to a halt. Of the 88 tanks that began the assault, only 28 returned to British lines. The following day, only 26 Matilda Ones and 2 Matilda Twos were still serviceable. The survivors fought a series of rearguard actions as the British Expeditionary Force retreated toward Dunkirk. On May 23rd, tanks from the 7th Royal Tank Regiment fought at Souchez. Later, a composite unit formed from survivors of both battalions counterattacked at La Bassée. Only 2 tanks reached Dunkirk in the closing stages of the evacuation. Nearly all British armour was abandoned in France, blown up to prevent capture by the enemy. Of the 140 Matilda Ones built, 97 were lost in France. The remaining 77 vehicles were withdrawn from service and used for training purposes. They never saw combat again. The Germans captured at least one Matilda One for evaluation. They destroyed it in the process of testing. There is some evidence that other captured vehicles may have been used briefly for internal security duties in occupied Poland, but the Germans saw no value in the design, and most were simply scrapped. Matilda One was not a failure of engineering. Sir John Carden and his team at Vickers built exactly what they were asked to build, a cheap, quick-to-produce infantry tank using commercial components. The failure was conceptual. The men who wrote the specifications were planning for the last war, not the next one. They imagined slow, grinding advances across static defensive lines, not the mobile warfare that would characterize the German blitzkrieg. The Matilda One was designed 20 years after the First World War ended, but it was essentially a First World War tank. Its designers believed combat in a new war would be the same as before, with tanks used for breaking through strong static defensive positions. This was a catastrophic misjudgment. The tank was also too small to be improved. Its hull could not accommodate a larger turret. Its engine could not be upgraded without a complete redesign. It was a dead end, a design that could not evolve to meet changing battlefield requirements. Perhaps most damning was the decision to arm the tank with only a machine gun. This made sense only if the enemy would cooperate by not deploying tanks of their own. Against German Panzer IIIs and IVs, the Matilda One was helpless. It could take punishment, but it could not dish it out. 3 Matilda Ones survive today at the Tank Museum in Bovington, England. One has been restored to running condition, though it uses a different engine and gearbox than the original. Looking at these small, cramped vehicles, it is difficult to imagine men going into battle in them. The Matilda One is often called the worst tank of the Second World War, and it is hard to argue with that assessment. It was slow, underarmed, and obsolete the day it entered service. Yet at Arras, Matilda Ones helped achieve something remarkable. The counterattack, though a tactical failure, caused panic at the highest levels of German command. Rommel reported that he had been attacked by 5 divisions. German commanders began to worry that their advance had outrun their supply lines. The attack contributed to Hitler's controversial decision to halt his panzers before Dunkirk, giving the British time to evacuate over 300,000 soldiers. A truly terrible tank, crewed by brave men, had helped save an army. The Matilda One teaches us that designing for the last war is always a mistake. It reminds us that budget constraints and conservative thinking can produce weapons that are obsolete before they reach the battlefield, and it demonstrates that even the worst equipment, in the right circumstances, can make a difference. The Matilda One was a bad tank, but the men who fought in it deserved better.